Okay, so I've called this talk Building Shelley. That's because my kind of toy project, not for this talk, but something I was developing and suggested to Yannick when he approached me to do a talk. That was basically the thing I was building. What I wanted to do was to build something that sat on the console, because that's where I live. I live on the command line. I was by then already using ChatGPT, but I really wanted to be able just to kind of type AI, the name of a conversation, continue a conversation, and also avoid necessarily having to paste things in. I wanted to be able to point at files and so on and so forth. So basically, I wanted to do what developers do, which is to build something relatively cool, or something that fitted my itch or worked with my itch. That said, we may not get to the kind of the Shelley part of it, because when I did a test of this, I barely got through the probably the most important stuff, which is talking about how you make the connection to OpenAI, how you work with the AI, and some of the settings that might be useful to know about. So yes, why this project? I've told you pretty much. I'm a PHP developer, so PHP was the first option really for me. Do a bit of other languages, but I know every box I've got PHP there. So I decided to go with that. So it's fast for development, always there. Why not PHP? Well, Python is probably a better option if you want to have a really kind of deep tool set. And I have a couple of times found myself actually writing little Python tools that I kind of shell out to for stuff. But actually, PHP, obviously, as people are beginning to write more and more code and get more and more engaged with it, the tool set is getting deeper with the PHP. Okay, so I'm talk a little bit about large language models. I think that, and GPT, I think that people pretty much know this landscape. And actually, I just asked GPT. I just asked my chatbot, what is GPT? Because again, we're going to get into stuff which is deeper than my core knowledge. But it is generative pre-trained transformer. I can tell you, because I listened to the Hard Fork podcast, that transformer is the bit that Google invented. Large-scale training, obviously, trained on billions of documents. It is built with chat in mind, although when I first started using it, it was built with completion in mind. I'll talk a bit about that. Okay, so OpenAI with PHP. So there is a very clean and easy API at the OpenAI site. Various libraries. One I use is the Orhan-Ade OpenAI library, but pretty much because the API itself is very clean, they're going to be much of a muchness. And I'm going to give you a curl example. Throughout, I've pretty much used the library, but it's nice to go a little bit lower level just to kind of get a sense of what might be happening under the hood with libraries. So working with the chat models, so that's the GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, which is pretty much what you'll be using if you're doing this. The endpoint that you'll use for chat is chat completions. The authorization step is very simple. It's just a header. And then the next thing to think about really is the payload. And the most important part of the payload is messages. It's an array of arrays with two elements, role and content. Pretty self-explanatory. Role can be one of three, either assistant, user, or system. And I'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. But pretty much, as you'd expect, we are the user, and GPT is the assistant. One thing to note here is that you are expected to spoof it. So while this information here in messages will include your conversation with the API, You set up the mood, if you like, and the background context by acting out a conversation with the API. So it's quite typical that you'll have 4 or 5, an exchange of 4 or 5 messages that you author yourself to give a sense of how you want the conversation to continue. So once I've defined a model, my message or my set of messages, then really it's just a matter of going through the what I hope are familiar steps of sending a post request to OpenAI. And this is the response. It's pretty compact, although it goes below the bottom of my slide here, but there isn't much. There's basically a couple of closed brackets. That's about the extent of it. Now, obviously, in a longer conversation, the meat of that is going to be under content there. It's going to be big, but the envelope, if you like, is pretty minimal. A library version of the same same or similar query. The only difference here, really, to note is that I have included a system call. Now, the idea is that a system will set up a premise. So you say that you are a fun-loving PHP expert that's standards compliant, whatever, and it is pretty good at responding to that. Some of the documentation I've read has suggested that system is not always adhered to, so it's a good idea often to reinforce the system. So what I tend to do is to send a system message and then a quick user assistant response, which just reiterates the system premise. The other thing to note here are the arguments or the further arguments, temperature, max tokens, frequency penalty, and presence penalty. In the previous example, I didn't include all of them. That's because you can get away without it most of the time. It will default. But I'm about to go through what they mean and how they might be useful to you. So a library output, the question I asked it was about the first known mechanical calculating machine. Interestingly, and this has happened about 4 or 5 times throughout authoring this deck, it gave me about 4 different answers for 4 different runs of the system. They weren't necessarily wrong answers. They were valid interpretations that were different, if you see what I mean. But where I checked what it said the right thing, but they weren't necessarily the earliest ever. This one, it gave me a 17th century device. Okay, completion versus chat. Now I'm going to flip through the completion side of things pretty quickly, but the previous to the chat models, probably the kind of acme, the king of models was Da Vinci. It was a completion model, so it was optimized to deal with a single prompt. However, it was very good at recognizing structured data within a single prompt. So it was almost always used in the chat context, or not almost always, but it was very often used and perfectly happily used in the chat context. You might find that there's a use for Da Vinci. I have found that pretty much it's been perfectly fine to kind of migrate more or less to chat. I will, though, show you very briefly. This is just another. I'm going to replicate my queries using a completion. So I'm using the text Da Vinci 3 model, and because it's a different kind of model, because it's a completion model rather than a chat model, I have to use a different endpoint. So rather than chat completions, I use completions, and I'm sending prompt there rather than messages. But you know that's a minor difference as far as usage is concerned. Again, same thing, but oh, there's my output. Yeah. There's the library version. Again, it's a different method. So for the library, I'm calling completion rather than chat, but it's the same idea. And again, I asked it what the earliest historical reference to Brighton was, and it gave me 4 different answers ranging from 477 to 1086. So trust but verify. Yeah, because briefly on the models. GPT-4 is, well, as of yesterday or a few days ago, it may have been released by now, it was waitlisted. I've got it. It's not vastly different from the 3.5 in my experience. You'll be absolutely fine with the 3.5 if I mean, by all means, put yourself on the waitlist for GPT-4. It'll be out before you know it. It's expensive, comparatively speaking. GPT-4 32K, vastly enhanced capacity, and we'll talk about tokens briefly soon, but it is much more expensive. So you'd only use it if you really need that capacity. GPT 3.5 turbos, you're going to be a penknife. It's super cheap. It's not got a huge capacity, but for most chat usage, day-to-day chat GPT kind of type communication, it's perfectly good. You'd always start with 3.5 and migrate to a specialized model as you need it. And we've already seen briefly the one completion model there is the Da Vinci. So I earlier on showed you the arguments that you could send through with your query or the additional parameters. Temperature is probably the most interesting. Temperature is an indication of or determinant of randomness. And people often equate that with creativity. The extent to which it is creativity, I suppose, is a philosophical one. But it is true, you're going to get more variation in an answer, but possibly less veracity at a higher number. And you're going to get a more robotic, monotonous, but possibly accurate answer with a lower number. The range is generally between 0 and 1, but it is model specific. That said, I've never seen anything other than between 0 and 1. But yeah, check your models. 0.5, I just generally stick with 0.5 and it's fine. But if you're right, if you're asking it to do something, I sometimes use it for fiction, not for writing fiction, but for generating plot outlines or for dealing with for working out branching narratives, that sort of thing. You might want to go higher because you want it to be as wacky as possible. And if you wanting it to actually stay within the bounds of some kind of version of reality, you might want it to go lower. Max tokens is very important. So when you speak to the or when you query the model, or you query the model, you can say how big you want your response to be. So a token, you can think of it broadly like words. It isn't, but it is the unit of language parsing for the AI model. And it will vary, the size, the nature of a token will vary from model to model. When you send your message, that's going to be incorporated into the number of tokens that's used, and as will the response. So you need to bear in mind that your query and the response of the model both have to fit within the maximum capacity of that particular model. If your context, if the query you're sending it is already too big, you'll get an error. So that means if you're going to write anything of any seriousness, you need to check the size of the message before you send it. I suppose you could send it and catch the exception. But then obviously that's an expensive operation, so it's better to catch it. PHP offers, or someone has kindly ported a tokenizer for PHP, which works perfectly well. It's PHP, it's GPT-3 rather than 4. I have found them so far. I can't see the difference, and I don't know enough about the under the hood technical stuff to tell you what the distinction might be. At the moment, Most people are using GPT 3.5. This will be fine, and hopefully we'll get new tools in the future. There are some nice Python tools that if one needed it, you could quite easily write a tiny little Python tool for it. So anyway, yeah, it's important to know how many tokens you're using before you send your query, and to do the very basic sums as to how much you're sending in your query and how much you're expecting to get back. The total of those two have to come in under the size of the capacity, the model capacity. There are a couple of penalties, frequency penalty and presence penalty. They're not tremendously important, or at least I haven't used them very often. Frequency penalty will encourage, the higher it is, the more variation you'll find in the language used. And presence quality, that's a bit like, you know, when you're at school as a 10-year-old doing a comprehension and you're told you absolutely have to repeat the question in the answer. If you've got a low presence penalty, it's likely that the chatbot will repeat your question as part of the answer. You can ask it to be a little bit more creative, and make some effort and rephrase the question somewhat so that it's not kind of robotic. With a higher presence penalty, I tend to just let the defaults work, and it's fine. This is a chatbot, and that will, without any error checking, without worrying about the size of the payload, that will get you a conversation. So if you just want to throw something together, you write something like that in 5 minutes, and you're away, really. Is there anything in this code that's interesting? I think we've probably covered everything. So we've got a system call, which is our premise. There's nothing very interesting in it. I've just said you are helping out with a talk. Then I go into a loop where I take in content from the user. I incorporate each of the user's inputs into my growing context. And then I send my message to the model, get the response, decode it, and then print out the answer. And pretty much this is just a cut and paste with a little bit of bold added to make it clear about just a conversation I had to test it about fibers in PHP. I'm not much wiser, to be honest, about fibers in PHP, but that's the conversation. So in some ways, that's it. That's all you need for a chatbot. But of course, there are issues here that if you want to build something which is a little bit smarter, you want to incorporate. First of all, you want to deal with worries about whether you're going to get errors as your context grows. Secondly, you want to give it a memory. You want to, so you can come back to conversations. You want to be able to switch between conversations. You want to add bolt-ons so that you can talk to your file system or to the internet. All these things are the things that are going to make the difference between something which is a Scratch script and something you want to do. How am I doing for time? Good? Okay. All right, so for the next bit, I had two options. Either I was going to show you what this little app that I've been building looks like, or I was going to go do a deep dive. I think it's more fun to see what it looks like. I will put the slides online so that you can look at the architecture, and I'll also open source. In fact, as of like half an hour ago, opened up Shelley, so if you want to download it and fork it and play with it, you can do that. With the caveat that I haven't actually got around to a README yet. This is the README, okay? All right, so simple command line chat app with persistence. I want it to be extensible, so I want to be able to drop in new commands to be able to extend its functionality really easy without changing core. I want to be able to manage multiple conversations, just like ChatGPT, or at least my own version. And I want to be able to maximize the context I send to GPT. This last bit is like crucial, because this is the thing that surprised me most about working with large language models, was the extent to which you had to provide its memory. You couldn't just speak to it and have it remember you. You had to package up, or you have to package up the whole context. That's kind of fine, but with a limited capacity, that means you very quickly run out. So you have to throw things out the back. What you want to do then is to look at techniques for summarization. So you've got to give yourself a nice limit somewhere along 3/4 line, maybe 2/3 line, and say, after this, we're going to go to summary mode to extend its understanding of the history of your conversation together, to give a sense that you are in a much deeper and more enduring relationship than just the 5 or 6 big files you've sent backwards and forwards. So these are all aspects we want to incorporate into Shelley. Okay, so this is an example of just firing it up without any prior history. It assumes a conversation name of default. It tells you it's got no history, and then I ask it about Silicon Brighton, and it gives me a nice potted history, which I don't know if it's true. There we are. Yeah, and it was much longer actually. It was very, very fully featured. Okay, I kill my process. I come back to it, and because I've given it memory, it's using SQLite. It loads the memory and gives me just a truncated version of what I was last talking about, so that if I come back to it after a break, I know where we're at, and also it knows. So because behind the scenes I'm using a database and firing up a context, it's as if we're continuing the conversation. Resuming a named conversation. So one of the things I want to begin to do is to have conversations where I have different threads for different types of work. So I probably have default for random questions, but I will have a PHP one, or an architecture one, or a project-specific one, and I'll want to be able to keep conversations specific to those tram lines. So this is just an example of resuming a named conversation. So there I say PHP-chat. Again, there's a summary, and we start talking. The other aspect I wanted to add was an easy mechanism for adding premise. So we've seen already that, or we've discussed already, we have the system command, or the system message, and also the convention that you also have a little conversation which reinforces the system message. So Shelley now has a little command premise which allows you to set your set your premise, set the context, the way you want it to engage with you. And then that will set the tone for the conversation. So when I come back to this later on, I ask it the best way to set a date. I've told it I want it to be standards compliant, and to use modern code. It likes old code. It's lazy. If you don't tell it that, it will probably use the old date functions. I would rather use the date time object, and it defaults to that. It does that because I've told it to, and it can be very good. So you can use it for things like agents, where you say, okay, well, you're my things to do agent. I want you to be proactive, and it will be. So it's quite an important feature that you can have different personalities for different threads. If I run premise without an argument, it will remind me of its personality. The other thing that's useful here, and this is probably more from a developer's point of view, although I suppose it's quite nice for in general, is to be able to see the context that you're sending. So if you pass it that, it will splurge out everything that it's sending it is going to be sending in its next query. Actually, the only thing that's really important here is to see how the premise works. So you can see the system at the top there. That's the premise proper, but you can see the next two, the user and the assistant. those are auto-generated, but by Shelley rather than by the AI or by the user to reinforce the premise. So that's right at the beginning of the context. And those stay at the top of the context within Shelley. So the premise and that initial kind of 1-2 is always maintained. It's the rest of the context that shifts, because you obviously have to throw things off the back of the context all the time, but you want to keep those there. Another couple of features, multiple line input. So by default, you want to be able to just type and hit return. Obviously, sometimes you want a continuation character, so it supports that. You can also use / or backslash, because it uses either M to go into multi-line mode, which is great for pasting in. Otherwise, it will, I think, just pick up the first new line and send. The only other thing on this page worth noting is that it got something wrong. It does that an awful lot, and it's always very confident about it. So I put a couple of lines from a poem in, and it told me it was from the first stanza. I said, well, actually, it's from the third, which it is. And it said, oh, yeah, sorry. Which is nice, actually, because the first time I used ChatGPT, it made stuff up and then told me I was lying when I tried to correct it. So at least it stood corrected in this case. Reading files. This is really why I wanted to write this thing. I didn't want to be pasting stuff in. If I'm writing to code and I want it to look for errors in my code, or I want it to generate a unit test, I don't actually want to paste things in. I want to point it to a file. So /file, and then you can point it to a file on your file system, or you can point it to a URL, as long as your PHP INI is set up to allow that. There's a big caveat here that HTML uses up a huge number of tokens. It's really hungry. So you will hose it, hose your context really quickly by pointing it at an HTML file. I have, and obviously there are strategies to deal with that. I haven't implemented them yet, but one thing for certain is you can break things up into smaller chunks, or you can write code which will create text versions if you're only interested in the context, and so on and so forth. That's for the future. So a quick overview then. So we've looked at them really, most of them context. We've seen file, we've seen multi-line mode and premise. The only other two are buffer, which is just to show you what you're about to send. Because if you've been authoring stuff with multiple lines and then you've added a file, you might see what you're about to send. So if you give it buffer, it will show you what you think, what you're about to send off to the AI, and redo, which will forget your buffer for you if you've made a mistake and you want to do it over. Things to do. Well, it's dog food. It needs a lot of work. It hasn't got a help command at the moment, so I won't show you the commands that are in there. I'd like to see it better extended. At the moment, the various commands are hard-coded. They're very modular, but they're still hard-coded in source. So obviously, what we want is a system where you can drop them into a directory or add some configuration, and they'll automatically be added. Very easy to do, so I should do it. History search, various data connectors to be able to connect to Google Docs. Basically, there's a tool if you want to see something, the really mature tool in Python land called LangChain that has all this stuff. I mean, it's like that's what one wants, is to be able to connect it to the internet and to the world. I'm using kind of pretty basic readline at the moment, so it just runs readline. But I'd like to be able to put history in, so you can hit the up button to get previous commands, better completion, and I'd like to shell out as well. Also, maybe editor integration so I can get my Vim. How are we for time? Yeah? Okay, so I'll do a quick architecture overview then. The core of it, which we've pretty much already seen, is that comms on the right-hand side. That is the comms part of Shelley is just a class wrapper around the the queries, 3 or 4 queries we've already seen. Obviously, we want to manage the communications so that there is within this arena there is actually not shown on this diagram, which is why I'm stumbling. There is also a messages object which manages the context. So rather than just pass in a raw array, we want to pass in a object which manages the context, does the checking for us to make sure that the context is within the model's capacity. And we also want to represent the model. So most of the time when we see diagrams, architecture diagrams with the word model on, we think of MVC, model view controller. But this is actually just a representation of the model, the AI model, which obviously determines things like the token capacity. So a runner looks in towards the AI, gets information from the saver, which is just a mapper using SQLite at present, and then at the front end, a UI component which is extended with the various UI commands that we've already discussed. This is a representation of the context problem, how we deal with, as I've already described to you, how you can fit only so much into a context. So the messages object, which I spoke to you briefly, manages this context, and it's smart enough to work out at a key point where and how to break things down into smaller messages, into summarization. Now, the nice thing about this, of course, is we've got the perfect tool for summarizing text, which is the AI itself. So let me look back at some of these. Yeah, there we go. If you see at the bottom of this multiple line input example, just before user at the bottom, it says summarizing done. What's going on there is that not quite in the background, but after the assistant has returned, it then picks up that query and response and makes a subquery to the AI to put a summarized version of the content into the database, into that row, which basically means that we don't have to summarize live, we've got it cached. So whenever we need to turn our content into a summary, it's sitting there. Of course, it would be nice to do that in a thread, but I didn't want to go there. And in fact, I've never found, because you're reading this stuff, I've never found that I'm held up by the time it takes, the 10 seconds or so, for the summary to happen. If it were to, I'd fix it. But yeah, so far, it's not been a problem. So yeah, the summarization solution, I think I pretty much described to you. The runner, which is the messages object, works out the calculation as to where to split between the two. The runner makes the summarization, and the process UI, which is the front end part, calls the runner to make the summary after every query. Yeah. So finally, UI commands. We've pretty much covered what they are. In terms of the architecture, pretty straightforward. We just have a command interface and an abstract command that does some that has some actual functionality that's shared. The name, file or redo or whatever is there. There is a matches, basically a regular expression which is shared. And then execution. And the execute method is pretty much what the implemented command is. So the idea is it's going to be super easy to add new commands to this, because all you need to do is create a new command. Everything else is handled for you. You've got the buffer coming in. You change the buffer. That will be what goes out. So you can basically, you've got a pipeline now. You can basically just drop in a new command, and it should be really easy to extend Shelley. And there you go. This is the hard-coded version that I'm looking forward to killing and replacing with something a bit more dynamic. As of now, it's sitting there in the process UI class in the constructor, hard-coded. But you can see how easy that will be to turn into something a little bit more dynamic. And yeah, that's it. I mean, you know, I could go deeper, but I think I've talked enough for now. You can reach me at GetInstance.com. I occasionally blog at GetInstance.com. You can get me at matt@GetInstance.com. And I've just, big caveat, I've just made public, but I haven't even bothered. I haven't even got as far as a README. But if you want to clone it, play with it, then do. I will also add a README in the next week.